listening to Mark's talk, I just kept thinking of that scene in Young Frankenstein, where they're at the graveyard digging up the body, and it starts to rain. And worth reseeing. I'm going to give you a talk here today about Prohibition in Washington, D.C. It's such a remarkable story. D.C. was expected to be the model dry city for the nation's capital. And in fact, it turned out to be anything but, because during Prohibition we had up to 3,000 speakeasies across the city. And so there were a lot of unintended consequences that came out of Prohibition. And what happened here in Washington, D.C. really echoed nationwide. It wasn't just, okay, we had our own little speakeasy, certainly, and several thousand bootleggers and so on. But because all the national laws were passed here, what happened here basically echoed nationwide and was, as we'll talk about here today, was crucial for the undermining of Prohibition as the wet cause started to rise up here again and, for repeal of Prohibition. The book itself, which came out in March, I wanted to make this both a history and a guidebook for Prohibition. So in other words, we put 5 different neighborhood maps within the book, so you could see basically where all the different mayhem occurred. That's where we are right now, right next to First Congregational Church. That's where DC, where the library is here now today. But so you can basically follow along in the book and then look on the map and say, hey, I want to go check out this one site, if that site still exists. Much of downtown has changed, unfortunately, but certainly DuPont Circle, Capitol Hill, some of the outlying areas are today just as they were back then. It's really remarkable. So we're very fortunate that we actually have this preservation. That said, though, of course, downtown, what you see on much of that there is gone, unfortunately. So, but it's victim to redevelopment in the 1960s, 1970s, and so on. We also put in the map 80 different images. Sorry, in the book we put 80 different images, some of which I got here at the library. A lot I got from the Library of Congress. And then most importantly, for those of you who are cocktail drinkers, we put in 11 different cocktail maps, 9 of which are specific to DC. So we, just in the last couple of years, we've had this resurgence of interest in cocktails, craft cocktails in particular. But it's largely forgotten that, gosh, back in the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, and so on, DC had a significant cocktail scene. We also had a big brewing scene, which I'll talk about as well. And much of which was simply just forgotten about, and then just in recent years it's being resurrected. I lead a tour called the Temperance Tour. It's of Prohibition sites in DC, and I'll be leading that this afternoon, an abbreviated version of it. So I'll be hitting a couple different sites. How many of you all know that we have a temperance fountain here in DC? Wow, awesome. It's historians, right? Most people are like, we have a temperance fountain in the city? Really? We're one of the few cities that has one left, which is pretty cool, and almost got knocked down. I'll talk about that during the tour. And we'll also hit Calvary Baptist Church, which was built by Adolf Kloos. And for those of you who might have seen the Kloos exhibit, these are all pieces right behind me, right behind us, from the Kloos exhibit. That was 7 or 8 years ago. So we'll talk about Adolf Kloos here during the tour as well, because there was a significant event that happened at Calvary Baptist Church related to the temperance movement. Alrighty, so what I want to talk about is sort of the surprises of my research. What did I learn writing about Prohibition? We know Prohibition, as H.L. Mencken called it, was the 13 awful years. It's also called the Noble Experiment, and so on. And we changed the Constitution, and then less than 14 years later, we changed it back because it failed so utterly. So we all know that. That's all kind of established now, and probably a lot of people watch the Prohibition series. So I want to talk about what were some of the surprises I discovered during my research about Prohibition in DC. What made DC kind of different than other cities? For one, and I got this photo here from Johnny Ferrari, and is he here, by the way? There's John right there. John, by the way, just published this new book, just came out really recently, called Lost Washington, D.C. And he'll be speaking this afternoon. This here was Rum Row in Washington, D.C. This was the place in the city where you went to go get a drink. On Pennsylvania Avenue, there were 47 bars and saloons between the Capitol and the White House. Today, there are hardly any at all. But this was Rum Row. You can see a couple of the buildings there still exist. You can see the National Theater, you can see the Treasury Department, and you can see the Willard Hotel. But everything in between, where all those great bars were and so on, those were all knocked over, and that's now where the J.W. Marriott Hotel is. Right behind the 3 little trees, that little yellow building right there, that was Shoemaker's. that was our most important bar we had in the city. It was also known as Cobweb Hall. And this was where the Ricky was invented. The Ricky is now DC's claim to cocktail fame. In fact, we got the city council back in July to declare it as our native cocktail. And now we're one of 2 cities in the country that has a native cocktail. The other city is New Orleans. And can you guess what cocktail theirs is?
Hurricane.
It's not the Hurricane, no. Second choice, what's that? What's that? Say that. No, it's not the hand grenade. It's the Sazerac. Yeah. The Hurricane was, its provenance actually comes from Wisconsin. Yeah. But the Ricky was invented in the 1880s at Shoemakers, and it was named after the owner of the place, Colonel Joe Ricky, who was a Democratic lobbyist from Missouri. And so we used the book as part of the documentation that we presented to the city council, and then therefore we got our proclamation from Jack Evans, pushed that through. So now we have a native cocktail here in our city. One of the key stories I concluded in the book was a story called The Bottom of the Barrel, and that dealt with the DC brewing culture that we had here. And a key person for this, and when you write a book, by the way, you think it's just yourself writing it? No, it's a collaborative effort. I mean, John helped me out with this. For that particular chapter on the brewing, Cindy Yankee, this is right here in the front row in lavender, was absolutely crucial for this chapter, because she took me on a tour of all these different sites. We have 4 big breweries in the city, all of which were knocked down. This was the largest one. This was the Christian Heinrich Brewing Company, which is now the site of the Kennedy Center. So there were 2 breweries in Foggy Bottom and then 2 on Capitol Hill, and all of them are gone. We have hardly any trace at all, architecturally, of this very, very extensive brewing culture that the city once had. You know, the brewers were once the 2nd largest employer in the city after the federal government. And on Capitol Hill, it was the 2nd largest employer after the Navy Yard. So pretty significant. You know, you think at the time we had a big German-speaking community in the city, and you know how god-awfully hot our summers are, right? So you think, okay, what do people drink in the summertime? How do they survive without air conditioning? They drank beer and they drank Rickies. You know, this is how you survived back then. You drank. numb the pain. This is again one of the last surviving buildings we have to reflect that we had this significant brewing culture in the city, and that's the Christian Heinrich home, which is also called the Brewmaster's Castle, which was also, of course, the home until 2003 of the DC Historical Society, and it's since moved over to the Carnegie Library. And Scott Nelson, who's the director over there, over the last 5-6 years, he got hired I think 6 years ago, has been restoring the rooms one by one. So has everybody taken a tour of the place since they've restored it? A few people have. Awesome. If you have not done so, please do so at some point. It is a magnificent building. It's one of the last few great Victorian buildings we have in this city, and the fact that they have all this stuff original to the family since essentially the family bought the house back and created the museum, they've all been donating the furniture and plates and all kinds of things back into the house. And it's really remarkable to see the job that Scott's been doing here, getting the house restored. So he's tackling one room after the next here in recreating the building. Another big surprise I had in the book, and there's a couple different surprises out of this, I wanted to write a chapter about the African American experience in Washington, D.C. during Prohibition. The city at the time was 25% African American. And so I thought, okay, that's pretty significant. I need to write about this. What I discovered, though, was, oh my gosh, this was the most difficult thing to actually go research. Half of my research time was researching this one question, because, as I soon discovered, the city still had Jim Crow law in place. So the African American institutions were separate and parallel to the white institutions, including the press. And much of our sources we come about through writing about Prohibition. We have biographies, and the big thing that I used was newspaper accounts of raids and those kind of things. And we had 4 big newspapers at the time, I should say 4 white newspapers at the time. They wouldn't talk about black stories at that time. Then it came until much later. So the black community had its own institutions, and it had its own press. And so a lot of the research I did was actually right here, in this room and over in the Black Studies room over there, going through microform, looking through the Washington Bee, just to try to find out what did black people think about Prohibition. And I did, in fact, come across a couple of thought leaders, one of which was Calvin Chase, who was the publisher until he died in 1922, of the Washington Bee. And this photo is actually of his house, which is just a couple blocks away from here. It's knocked over. It's right across the street from that restaurant, Aguen. It's on I Street, which is now an office building. But that was knocked over in the 1980s, unfortunately. But he said about the temperance movement, he was very much a temperance opponent. And what he said was here, why should the colored people ally themselves with a white temperance organization as a Jim Crow annex? He recognized effectively that the temperance movement wanted to impose sobriety upon the black community as a way to control African Americans. He saw that, and therefore he wrote very stringently, very harshly against the temperance movement. On the other hand, there were other thought leaders within the black community that were very much in favor of it, such as Kelly Miller, who was the dean at Howard University. And I found a great quote from him toward the end of Prohibition, where he wrote about saying, essentially he was recognizing that within the black community, no one is obeying Prohibition. And okay, that's fine. If the black community does not obey Prohibition, well then it's fine for the white community to disobey the 14th and 15th Amendment, which was actively going on until the election and so on. So he basically framed this as a moral argument that we have to obey it, therefore the white community will give us our rights. So, but from everything I found, the black community was very, very active in undermining Prohibition, as much as the white community was. You think about U Street during the 1920s. This was the era of the speakeasy. This was the era of jazz. And cocktails and jazz always went together. I mean, they always did. We know that from Harlem, which was the 1920s, the era of the Harlem Renaissance. The same thing happened on U Street here. Just the thing about U Street at the time, it was called, one historian called it the secret city, because whatever happened on U Street, because it was a black neighborhood, if you got arrested or so on, it wouldn't be reported in the press. And therefore, a lot of white people went over to U Street to be entertained, to the jazz clubs and so on, and if you got in trouble, well, it didn't really reflect on anything because it wouldn't be reported about in the press. So, yeah, this became a major destination, not only because the baseball stadium was there at the time, but because of all the different jazz clubs and so on. It became a great era for people to go out and have fun and so on, and largely drawn because of U Street and live entertainment. The last area I wanted to talk about here was how much DC was involved in the undermining of Prohibition nationwide. This is a very famous quote here from the man who authored the 18th Amendment. His name was Senator Morris Shepherd. He was from Texas and one of the leading progressives in Congress, and in fact probably one of the few congressmen who actually was dry. Most congressmen, as we'll talk about, in fact did drink, despite them all taking a pledge to support dry law. Because of the Great Depression, there was a great movement underway to cancel or to repeal dry law. And so there was this big movement of people coming out and saying, you know what, we could have all these jobs back nationwide. When Prohibition went into effect in 1920, 250,000 jobs were lost. Suddenly in 1930, 250,000 jobs looks pretty awesome. I mean, you can recreate these jobs again. We can put a lot of people back to work. We can get the tax dollars running and so on. So Senator Shepherd made this comment, essentially rolling out the what's the term for that? Laying out the gauntlet for the wet cause, saying, effectively, over my dead body, are we going to repeal Prohibition? And his statement in this, by the way, took place in September 1930, basically framing up the election that's about to happen within 2 months. And he says, there's as much chance of repealing the 18th Amendment as there is for a hummingbird to fly to the planet Mars with a Washington Monument tied to its tail. So that lays out the gauntlet then for the wet cause, and boy, howdy do they strike back. So there is a local organization, actually a national organization, but it has a local chapter called the Crusaders. And it was headed up by a guy named Rufus Lusk, and his grandson, Rufus Lusk III, provided me photos as well. This guy was a real estate guy. He was into data, and he figured out, you know what, and he was an Irishman, so he drank, and he was a company commander during World War I, so he was very much offended by Prohibition and did everything he could to undermine the cause, so the white could start the dry cause. One of the things he came up with was, you know what, if I could take all the data from the Metropolitan Police Department, from all the speakeasy raids, and then put those on a map and then publish it, we can embarrass the hell out of the wet cause, out of the dry cause, because we're going to show that DC is anything but this model dry city. The fact that we had 3,000 speakeasies across the city. So he publishes 7 months worth of data in 1930, just 1 month, within just a couple weeks after Senator Shepherd had made this statement. This makes national press. This showed 934 speakeasies that were raided in a 7-month period during 1929. 2 years later, he publishes another speakeasy map, and this shows all the data from 1931. There are 1,155 speakeasies on this. And this is one of the things I really had to go dig to find this, but this was in the Library of Congress. And I found the 1932 speakeasy map. And are you guys ready to see it? This is it. Dots mark the spot where booze has been bought. 1,155 speakeasies where they found alcohol, where the Metropolitan Police Department conducted raids. There were another 600 sites where they conducted raids where they didn't find anything, whether that was because the police were tipped off, or the speakeasy was tipped off, or people managed to destroy the liquor in time, or hid it, or drank it all before the police got there. I mean, who knows? But yeah, this is remarkable. This really embarrassed the dry cause, because this showed that DC was anything but a model dry city. And again, this was published at the end of September 1930, so shortly before the midterm election. Just a month later, probably the most famous bootlegger that comes out of Prohibition publishes his story, and it's this man. His name is George Cassidy, who's better known today as the man in the green hat. And he was a bootlegger for Congress for 10 years. So he actually worked at the congressional offices. He worked 5 years on the House side in the Cannon House office building, and then he was arrested in 1925, and so he shifted over at that point over to the Senate side because senators were more discreet, he described. He was arrested for the final time in February 1930, and he then promised as part of his plea agreement never to bootleg again. So in October 1930, he comes forward with his story, and in grand style, and 5 front-page articles in the Washington Post. This makes national headlines, so that these stories are repeated here and published here nationwide. And what he basically tells, he tells the entire story, everything other than naming names. That's the one thing he doesn't do. But he tells us the entire story about where he bought his booze, how he jumped on the train, went up to New York or to Newark or Philadelphia or Baltimore, and then trudged back with his liquor in his suitcases. How he took those suitcases into the Cannon and Russell office buildings, and then how he distributed it to all the congressmen. He estimated, as a result of his experience 10 years bootlegging for Congress, that 80% of Congress drank. In fact, another senator remarked that the number of dry senators could fit into one taxi. So, I mean, if you guys saw the Ken Burns series, the very last, there were 3 different themes they covered. The very last night was a nation of hypocrites. It was because everyone is saying, oh yeah, we'll obey and so on, but in fact, no one's obeying it. Everybody's blowing off the law of the land. And this, of course, leads to the country really questioning, now why did we change the Constitution to ban alcohol? I mean, we just changed the law, we changed the Constitution. And ultimately, with the Great Depression, and people started questioning, is this the right thing? Can we maybe get these jobs back, and so on? So these catalytic events that happened in September and October 1930 here in Washington, D.C. echoed nationwide and really helped undermine the dry cause. And that ultimately, just 2 years later, leads to FDR being elected, and then shortly after that, the 21st Amendment passing through Congress and then getting ratified. So the Noble Experiment, like I said, comes undone in less than 14 years. It's the only constitutional amendment ever repealed. And alcohol was the only consumer product ever mentioned in the Constitution, and the only one ever banned. So it's kind of a crazy history, but we'll talk about that more this afternoon for those who can join me on the Temperance Tour. A couple events here to rope those who want to come in on. We have the Temperance Tour this afternoon, and that will start. I'm going to attend Johnny DeFerrari's seminar this afternoon, and so whichever room that one's in, probably 3:10 or so, we'll kind of all collect together, and then we'll all walk down to the Temperance Fountain, which is probably a 7-minute walk or so from here, and we'll start the tour from there. We have, for those who are going on the Lafayette Square walk, and a few people I think mentioned they wanted to do both tours, which is totally fine. All you have to do if you go on the Lafayette Square tour, When you end, just walk down Pennsylvania Avenue until you get to 7th Street, and you'll see right there at the corner is the Temperance Fountain, right next to the the monument to the Grand Army of the Republic. There's also a Starbucks right there within 50 feet of the Temperance Monument, Temperance Fountain. That's the fountain right there, by the way. Yeah, that's the Temperance Fountain, exactly. You probably walked past it and you've never really noticed it. Yeah, everyone's walked past it, but you know, it's there. We have the National Press Club Book Fair and Authors Night coming up here in a week and a half. Big deal, 150 authors are going to be there. I'm there as well. So it's a great time to get your books signed and Christmas gifts and so on. And then finally, this is the 4th year we've done the Repeal Day Ball. Repeal Day, by the way, was December 5th, 1933. That was the day that Utah voted for the 21st Amendment, which put the amendment over the top. Yes, Utah was the state. And there was a big national celebration. So DC kind of, we have this big cocktail culture here now. So the DC Craft Bartenders Guild, for the last 4 years, has hosted a Repeal Day Ball. So it's a lot of fun. It's actually going to be on December 3rd. So it's always on a Saturday night at the Halcyon House in Georgetown. And with that, we have a few more minutes, and we'll be glad, the three of us, to take any questions that you guys might have.
Gentleman at the National Archives named Rod Ross. I have the citations. They were through the legislative materials. So if you go into the National Archives into the finding room and you ask for legislative help, someone like Rod Ross can come help you try to find those documents. The House materials are online. I found them through the Hopkins website. I go to Johns Hopkins, but I'm sure the people at the National Archives can help you find them. It's a published 418-page report on investigation of the Treasury Department.
Next week, I saw you.